Good morning and welcome to our first episode of the Ethereum Bull. My name is Devin, and I'm joined by my good friend Adriano. Um, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this show? It's all based on Adriano's bull case for Ethereum relative to Bitcoin. You can check it out at Ethereum_bull on the Twitter site. There's a link right there from our profile. So the Ethereum Bull is really a community with high conviction for Ethereum. Together, we study the market, openly discuss technological, social, cultural, and economic impacts of Ethereum. And we discuss that relative to the other blue chip blockchain out there, Bitcoin. We see both playing a role, but we have a very specific view on how that's going to play out. And through our Twitter account and this podcast and other methods of communication and engagement with the community, we hope to develop this thesis even further, engage in dialogue about it. We want folks to constructively poke holes in it so we can solidify our points of view and just help the community learn and grow in the process. My name is Devin. I came to meet Adriano through a tweet. It was a tweet from Real Vision. They were looking to hire a writer, and Adriano says, not interested in writing, but check this out. And I checked out the thesis and I read it. Much of it was over my head, but I knew two things when I read it. One, this guy did his homework. And two, well, I need to learn more. So I reached out to Adriano and asked if we could start putting something together to get his message out. This was a number of months ago. But what ended up happening is we just kept talking every week and I was learning more and more. We took a shot at recording some shows and we've got some back footage that we may share as we evolve the community. But for now, we're kicking off with this episode. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Adriano. But before I do, I just want to say as a community, we're really lucky to have him. He's got a rare mix of talent between understanding the technological, economic, and financial implications of the Ethereum blockchain. I've learned a ton from him, and I'm certain that through following the Ethereum Bull, catching these podcasts, you'll learn a ton too, and we hope you engage and provide lots of questions through the Twitter. So with that, Adriano, over to you. Tell the community who you are and what you're all about.
Thank you, Devin. So yeah, my name is Adriano, and I've been studying cryptocurrencies for about 4 years now. And before that, I'm a full-time programmer, software engineer, full stack software engineer that works with ERP systems and databases. And I also have a academic background in computer science, but also in economics. So I have actually two separate majors from two different colleges for that. So that gave me a good background to go into this journey of cryptocurrencies. And as I said, I've been studying it for about 4 years. And in the course of studying cryptocurrencies, I started developing my own thesis about it, and started trying to share through the multiple online social websites, including Raoul's Real Vision, my thoughts on it. And initially I was getting a lot of pushback from the community on these ideas. And the more pushback I got, the more motivated I felt to write about it and try to explain it better, so that it's something that I could share my thoughts on. And that's how I started writing the thesis for Ethereum, and shared that originally on Reddit. Got a lot of good responses from it, and at that time was just like a 5-page thesis on it, and that motivated me to write even more about it. And it turned into 5 pages turned to 10, and then 10 turned to 20, and now we're like up to 50 pages. And what I've learned was that, well, even though I think the material is better now, it's just too long, and it's too it's for someone that is uninitiated. Also, it's very difficult to start deep diving into a thesis that requires some background in economics, requires a little bit of background in cryptocurrency. So I decided to start breaking down the thesis in Twitter, And that's really how Devin and I met, through little chunks and, of the thesis and the engagement with the community to allow, if they had questions, and allow them to participate, and just break it down that way. So, and now this is just another step into trying to show the community the thesis, which is creating these videos for the thesis as well. So, what is this thesis in a nutshell? So Bitcoin. So we are Ethereum bulls, obviously, but I'm also a Bitcoin bull. But I view Bitcoin as digital gold. And generally, I think the market consensus on what Bitcoin is as an asset, most people, I'd say, would agree with that Bitcoin is this digital gold. And being digital gold means it has kind of this established potential for it, for market capitalization, and that would be equivalent to gold, maybe a little bit higher. That's about $11 trillion, right? So, Bitcoin as digital gold also means that, it's a relatively low risk asset, but high friction asset. And for the same reasons why gold couldn't work well as a form of money because of this high friction, that translates to the digital world, where Bitcoin, even though it seems like it's much better than gold because it is digital, and it is, but in digital terms, it still has high friction, right? So that means that, it's constrained. There's like a limited throughput that the network can operate. It doesn't have this full programmability capability, and a number of other problems with Bitcoin, where it creates friction for the asset. And for that reason, it really is similar to gold. And if it were to be used as a form of money, which a lot of Bitcoiners think it will be, then you have the risk into following the footsteps of gold, where paper money was created for gold because gold was an asset that was difficult to transact with, and it had that friction, and that created the opportunity for governments to create paper money, fiat money, which later created the opportunity for the system to become fractionalized, which later created the opportunity for the system to completely detach itself from gold and the gold standard, right? So the gold standard was created because there was a need to have something better than gold to transact. So you had this thing on the side, which was paper money that was supposed to have a one-to-one connection. But then because that one-to-one connection was really established on the basis of trust in the issuers of money, and in the case, it became the United States with Bretton Woods Agreement. And that trust couldn't be verified because the networks that held the reserves, sometimes were not even digital. It is like that the reserves were not auditable. So along the way, we know that those reserves were not really fully there. And further down the line with Nixon, he said, well, screw the gold standard. We're just going to print money. It's going to be fiat money. And unfortunately, that is the path that Bitcoin would take because of its limitations if it were to be used as money. So long story short, Bitcoin is a good form of asset as gold, which is a good store of value with high friction. It is potentially, going to go up a lot from now. I'd say at least $400,000 or $500,000 per Bitcoin, but that's kind of where, the value proposition for Bitcoin is. On the other hand,
can we let's pause on that one, because I think that you mentioned the friction, right? And we've talked in the past about the friction in the Bitcoin system, largely rooted in its definition of being hard money, in as much as it's highly decentralized, and many other trade-offs have been made for a more decentralized system that, to your point, creates friction for usage on the internet. But when we go back to the white paper for Bitcoin, it was meant to be a payment to payment, person to person solution without banks. So but you're saying there's too much friction in the system. It cannot reach it at the scale that would allow it to elevate beyond gold. Maybe talk a little more about
Yeah. So,
the
yeah,
friction in the
Bitcoin, the white
systems.
paper, the original idea was a peer-to-peer cash, electronic cash system. So, meaning not a reserve asset. Cash is like the actual thing you use. It's not something that just sits there and you use something else. That was
Right.
the idea. And along the way, the narrative for that changed. We had the battle of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, where Bitcoin Cash really wanted to pursue the less friction system, where they sacrificed decentralization for that. That was a big mistake strategically, because that was putting the horse ahead of the buggy. Because, well, Bitcoin wasn't really a form of cash at that time. It was really a speculative asset which had good monetary properties with the potential to become a good store value. That's a mouthful, but essentially what I'm trying to say is, like, it wasn't really at the time that this battle with Bitcoin Cash happened, which it was a fork of Bitcoin that tried to scale Bitcoin by just increasing the block size, and in doing so, making it more expensive to be a validator, and not a validator, but to be a node and to be a miner. Um, that sacrificed decentralization, and there was really no interest from the investors in the asset as a form of currency yet, and even today there is no interest in that, because the interest today is still mostly on this speculative nature, on it becoming a good store of value like gold. So the friction is kind of expected there, but more important than reducing the friction is not sacrificing the monetary properties that will lead it into a store of value. And it has to graduate. And if you want to become a currency of some kind, you have to go through this process of first becoming a speculative asset, and then becoming a store of value, and then maybe later started being used as a global currency, or a currency to some degree, maybe digital. So, but going back to the point of friction, this is something that is talked about a lot, especially in the Ethereum communities, and I haven't seen it being defined anywhere. So I tried to come up with my own
Yep.
definition for it. So let's go. I tweeted about it the other day, so I'm just going to read out the tweet. In a nutshell, what friction is. The term friction is used to describe all implied and explicit costs incurred from holding or transacting with a specific asset. That includes counterparty risk, security risks, pure user experience, the risk of debasement, transaction cost and latency, carrying cost, lack of programmability, lack of privacy, etc. So, that deserves its own podcast, so we can talk all about that. But in a nutshell, if you could have a system that is instantaneous, that has no counterparty risks, and then you have some kind of insurance against all these things, and the cost of that service and the cost of that insurance would be your cost of the friction, right? So if friction system that is frictionless doesn't have any of that, so there's zero cost for the latency and all the implied risks that go with it. So in the context of Bitcoin, it's lack of programmability. It's a big part of the friction that is created by Bitcoin, but the lack of a roadmap to scale the system in a way that fully preserves the properties of layer one of the main network of Bitcoin, that creates a whole lot of friction, right? So we're talking about two different things in here. We're talking about just the ability to use Bitcoin as a form of cash as we traditionally think about it, meaning interacting with things in the physical world, where we're just paying each other cash, and something else in the physical world is exchanged for it. That has to do with the scalability, but the lack of programmability means that now that we're moving, society is moving into a digital world where, there's this thing called the metaverse, where people are creating value digitally, and that value exists natively in bits and bytes and ones and zeros. Well, if you want to exchange that with no counterparty risk, it has to exist side by side with the money that is going to transact with it. And that's what you have on the Ethereum network. You don't have that in Bitcoin, because, well, Bitcoin has a very limited programmability. So there is some kind of like scripting that you can do with Bitcoin, but it's very limited. And then you can try to create things like NFTs and digital art in Bitcoin, but you're really trying to fit a a round peg into a square hole there. So it just doesn't work well. It's not made for that. That's why it doesn't work well. It's not made for that. It doesn't have the scalability. So there's a number of issues there. So long story short, all of this comes up to the fact that, Bitcoin has high friction, but because it's not trying to do that and it's not trying to evolve, and it has, accepted itself for what it is, and the protocol is what people call it has ossified, meaning there are changes to it, but not big changes, nothing that risks breaking the software potentially, then it means that it's also setting the ceiling for what it can be, right? So, and that ceiling is a digital form of gold, worth about potentially a little bit over $11 trillion on total market cap. Ethereum, on the other hand, has this roadmap to scale, right? So we're talking about Bitcoin currently. It does about 6 transactions per second on layer 1, and you can talk about the Lightning Network, but the Lightning Network, it's layer 2 that is really still bottlenecked by layer 1. We don't have to go into much detail there, but let's just talk about layer 1 itself, because that's what really fully preserves the properties of the system in terms of security and decentralization, permissionless systems. So layer 1 Bitcoin does about 6 transactions per second. Ethereum does about, right now, 14 transactions per second. And Bitcoin doesn't have any plans to scale that. Ethereum has. So there are two things coming to Ethereum that will scale 14 transactions per second to about 100,000 transactions per second, while fully preserving the security and decentralization properties, permissionless censorship resistance properties of layer 1. So that's huge, because you go from 14 to about 100,000, then you're comparing 100,000 transactions per second to 6 transactions per second. That's the layer 1, that's the bottom, the foundation for the system. So with that, in Ethereum, now you have a system that at the bare minimum, you can have that layer 1, that level of security, work on a global scale for at least savings account, the equivalent would be savings account, right? So the problem with Bitcoin is that we have 4.7 billion internet users, right? And if everyone wants to have the security assertions that Bitcoin provide, there is not enough bandwidth for that in Bitcoin. So that means you're going to have to rely on some other systems, and then again we go down a path of decoupling that it existed with the gold standard, and it's unavoidable in Bitcoin. That is avoidable in Ethereum. So that's very important. So for Ethereum to be a global currency, it has a path for that, and it has a path that is much more attainable than Bitcoin. And what's the market for that? Well, global money supply, M2, is about $100 trillion. Most of the currency in the world is being debased at record speed. So if you have this new type of currency that it's appreciating very rapidly in value right now, you could argue that it's still in the speculative stage, but that ultimately will have a non-inflationary monetary policy, potentially a deflationary monetary policy because of the economics of how the Ethereum network works, then that's very appealing. But on top of that, Ethereum has this change coming to proof of stake, where mining will go away, and the security of the system will be done by what's called staking, which is essentially using the balances of Ethereum accounts to allocate rights to process transactions. So instead of trying to compete for rights to process transactions in proof of work, where you're competing by spending resources, so it's a very resource intensive way of decentralizing the network. Now you have this other way that it uses cryptography itself to achieve the same thing, but it does it in a much more efficient way, and it does it in a way that stakeholders and the validators are aligned, because they both want the the currency to accruing value, where miners don't really care that much for it because they're just turning the asset around. But also, it has this dynamic where now if you own Ether, you have, Ether becomes a yield-bearing asset with a negligible risk. And now you're competing for a different type of market, which is this passive income market, the bond market. And that's $130 trillion market. And most bonds in that market have either, right now in the world, have either near zero or negative real interest rates. That means that when you account for inflation and you buy, a US government bond, you're actually losing money on it because the money is being debased at a faster rate than you're getting interest on it. So here comes this new thing that has a deflationary monetary policy that is currently yielding 5%, and it's entering this market as a global apolitical neutral asset, much like gold, but it has this yield-bearing property to it. So what's the total market for Ether? If we just look at these two things, that's about $230 trillion, $230 trillion. If Ether captures just 1% of that market, which is bananas, it's nothing, it's going to be worth $20,000. So today is it's September 30th, and we're all stressed out about the price of Ether going up, going down. This roller coaster is $3,000 right now. Don't worry about it. Go to sleep. Go take a walk.
Yeah, exactly.
$20,000 it's going to be peanuts.
Well, once people start reading the thesis and listen to this show, they're going to catch on. So the speculative pricing may kick in before we actually get that 1% of the total currency and bond market share. But yeah, I think you make a powerful point, right? With you put gold or you put Bitcoin in the context of a gold due to the properties, including friction, which is great securitization, good store of value. But that's an $11 trillion market cap, as you said, and there's too much friction to allow it to scale. And at 6 transactions per second on the layer 1, that's certainly not going to scale to be a global system.
It's just mathematically impossible, right? It's mathematically impossible, and the community doesn't want to address that. They say we're not going to sacrifice risking the protocol or making big changes to it. We're not going to do it. Okay, then you're committing to this high friction asset. It's mathematically impossible for it to serve. It's impossible, right? Unless they create with some new magic, which there is no roadmap for it. So based on all the roadmaps or all the things that are planned for it, it's not going to happen. So Bitcoin is going to be digital gold for at least the foreseeable future.
And you said at the beginning, what was it? There's still, a high target on Bitcoin when it fully claims that market position as the digital gold currency. What do you see the price being at when it claims that title for Bitcoin?
I'd say at least $400,000 or $500,000 at current, at the current value of the dollar. If they could keep debasing the dollar, it's going to be higher when it reaches there. But at the current price of the dollar, it would be $400,000 or $500,000.
Well, there's
upside good, right? It's about 10 times up from here. So can't complain about that. Can't complain about that. And it's really important. I think it's really important for Bitcoin to exist as digital gold in the same way that gold is really important for the economy, because it is a hedge against the bigger economy, right? Where if there's some kind of major issues as we're having right now with the monetary system, Bitcoin historically was a hedge. It's not so much today because gold was a hedge against the economy, but Bitcoin now is taking that role, and it's taking the role not just against the legacy physical economy. It's going to take the role into this digital economy that is being created. So it's really important for Bitcoin to exist as this safety net, especially because it is becoming more significantly different from Ethereum as it keeps evolving into, not only Ethereum has this smart contract, full programmability, now it's proof of stake. So these two protocols are becoming quite different, which is good. Because if you want, if you're maximalist for decentralization, and you want, you like, the properties of, the idea of what decentralization does, then it's good to have at least two different protocols that are significantly different, because you could have even today a potential flaw in one of these systems that haven't been exploited yet. And if someone does find a flaw either in the code or in the structure of how the economics work, then it's good to have a different system that is entirely different, because now you have a backbone for that. So if Ethereum fails for whatever reason it may be, it's very important to have something else that is resilient, and Bitcoin is resilient too, right? So digital gold is not just a meme. It's something that is very important, especially when the protocols for this digital economy are significantly different. So it's a safety net. That's what it is. It's uncorrelated. Right now they're both correlated, but in the long term, you'll see the same dynamic would be, Bitcoin will become uncorrelated from Ethereum, and it will be this kind of, if Ethereum goes through some kind of problematic phase or any type of higher risk assumption from the market, then Bitcoin becomes more appealing. So that dynamic will happen eventually, and there's good reason for that.
Love it.
Yep.
All right, let's hop into another topic. Okay, so Adriano, we've got a pretty solid conversation started around your thesis. I think we can sum it up nicely to say, both blue chip cryptocurrencies have a brilliant future ahead of them. Both will make our digital economy and the internet of the future a much better place, but they have specific roles that we see them playing. So, we understand Bitcoin, Ethereum, and where we stand there, but what about all these other altcoins and currencies that are emerging? How do they fit in the context of your thesis?
Yep. So, Bitcoin and Ethereum are kind of a different thing because they have such a focus on decentralization, and they have the network effects already, right? And so we know that in monetary networks, so Bitcoin, Ethereum having this monetary premium to them, we know that the network effects are very, very difficult to break. And you can look at just how Bitcoin and Ethereum evolved, in the sense that Ethereum is a huge technological step over Bitcoin because it has introduces smart contracts for programmability, yada yada, and the fundamentals for Ethereum are killing it, right? So when you look at the transaction count, transaction revenue, volume, and a lot of key metrics, Ethereum has already surpassed Bitcoin. But even with that fundamental difference in the technology itself and the network effects, Bitcoin is still number one. And it's still number one. Why? Because the monetary network effects are so hard to break. So when you take that idea and you look at all these other altcoins that are in the market right now, that are, more potentially, at least in the short run, more scalable than Ethereum and have some other marginal improvements over Ethereum, you have to think about whether or not they'll ever be able to gain traction with monetary premium, meaning being valued as a form of money, especially when you consider the effects of Metcalfe's law, that pretty much determines that the value of the networks is based on the number of users at an exponential rate, right? So it's the number of users squared. When you take that into account, and the fact that there are about at least 20 or 30 things that are competing with Ethereum and trying to be smart contract platforms, you have to take into account that they're all fragmenting network effects. Because if you're an investor or an user, you're not just picking one thing that is competing with Ethereum, you're going to pick one out of 30 things, right? So either you're going to have to distribute your money all across the 30 different ones, or you're going to have to pick one, but then someone else is going to pick a different one, right? So you might be a Cardano guy, someone else is going to be a Solana guy, someone else is going to be an Avalanche guy, or you might be into all of them, but then you're breaking down your money through all of them. And normally what happens is, in reality, users and investors will pick, a handful and Ethereum. So they'll pick a handful of Ethereum killers and Ethereum. That's normal. So Ethereum is at the center of all that. So what that leads to is that, all these networks, they can be valuable as forms of cloud services, right? Because they are providing scalability, at least in the short term, and they're also breaking down this kind of monolithic framework that Ethereum has, where now you have a different security system that maybe is used for different use cases, right? So, if you're talking about financial applications, well, we know that you want the highest security for that because it deals directly with money. And I think that is a value that has been captured by Ethereum. It's going to be very hard to be captured by other networks. But then when you're talking about maybe other things like gaming, like ERP, supply chain tracking, like verification of vaccine passports, of student records, there's a number of different things you can think of, and even leading towards the future of the metaverse, where maybe every tweet, every conversation you have, it's actually an on-chain record that gets created. You don't want that competing with block space for money, for financial assets, because just tracking down the history of a component in a manufacturing facility creates a certain amount of data that is less valuable than the data that you use to actually create money or transact with money. So that means that it's good to have all these different networks, because then it establishes different cost bases for use cases that can compete directly with the financial assets. So long story short, they have a value as, I think, as cloud service networks. And it's interesting that they are all actually, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are connecting to Ethereum. So in this process of trying to kill Ethereum, they're actually creating value added for Ethereum, because now Ethereum becomes the center of this mesh, of networks. And
you described them as the settlement layer before.
Pretty much,
you described them to me as a settlement layer for some of these platforms. And why you describe it, because the question I had, I think it's important for people to understand. You described it well to me. I asked you, so when you've got proof of stake, like you said earlier, being introduced, going to dramatically increase the transaction speed of the layer one Ethereum blockchain, dramatically. So what does that mean for the layer twos? Do they become obsolete? You had an answer for me on that.
For Ethereum?
Well, so if you've got Ethereum moving to proof of stake, which is going to increase their transaction throughput, right? Today, the layer twos are born building on Ethereum as a settlement layer to solve a transaction speed problem. So when P.S.S. is depends introduced to the year, what becomes of the L2s, and what is their role?
So proof of stake itself is not going to actually increase throughput. It is just going to decrease the operational cost of the network. So that's going to have an impact on just issuance. But what's going to increase throughput of Ethereum is called sharding, and it's just part of what is called Ethereum 2.0. And a lot of people get that confused. But so sharding is just going to break down the network into like different chunks. And each chunk will have the same capacity to process transactions as the main chunk that we only have one right now. So that's going to multiply the layer one capacity of Ethereum. But along with that comes this layer two solution called ZK rollups. And this is a solution that is equivalent to compressing the transactions and pushing them all into still the layer one. So even though there's a little bit of extra work that needs to be done to transact through layer twos, that way all the information for those transactions are going to be stored in layer one still. That means that there's no data availability risk. It means that there's no risk, if the network layer two starts, trying to censor users, or if the network goes down, users still can go directly to the Ethereum network and withdraw their funds. So that's what's fundamentally different about ZK rollups and anything else, even the Lightning Network, right? Because the Lightning Network, there's some elements to that, and that's when Lightning Network's the layer 2 for Bitcoin. But there's some issues with it, and one of the problems that Lightning Network has is data availability. Because essentially, how the Lightning Network works is you have to, first of all, you have to commit funds ahead of time into this kind of staging area. So you transfer money from your Bitcoin wallet to a multi-sig wallet that someone else is going to share with you. And once that money is locked in that wallet, that becomes a channel. And then in the Lightning Network, you're exchanging signed transactions with your peer for that channel, but you're not publishing that on the main network. So that means that now you're transacting with someone else, and there's data going from you to that person, transactional data, that is not actually backed by the Ethereum network, by the Bitcoin network. That means that, if they give you a payment and you receive that file, you receive like a little payment file, and you lose it, the file gets corrupted or you lose it, and you don't have a backup of it, then you're going to have to go back to that person and say, hey, can you send me that again? So there's a trust element because they already send it to you, and you already maybe, there was a transaction where, maybe you're selling your iPhone to that person, right? So they paid you, and then you gave the iPhone to that person. And then a week later, you was like, oops, I lost that transaction and it's not on the Bitcoin network. So now you have to find someone to give you that transaction again. So you have this trust element. So, and if they decide, no, I don't, they could say, I don't have it, or they say, I don't want to give it to you. And then you're out of luck, because that transaction that it was signed, it's essentially is an IOU, right? It's a redeemable IOU that is cryptographically verified. But until you go to the Bitcoin network and redeem that, you have this problem where the transaction is just kind of floating up in the air, right? So, and you introduce a data availability risk. And that's just one of the problems. We're not going to go into deep in Lightning Network, but in the Ethereum network, that works differently. With the ZK rollups, all the data for the transactions, even though it's a layer 2 network, all the data goes into layer 1, but it goes into a compressed way. So that means that now it can operate with more transactions, but you still have all the security assurances from layer 1. So that's, real incredible. And that's just a big step forward into the technology. That's for
and
Ethereum,
so you
though.
said that's coming with, that's the sharding, and that's separate from ETH 2.0 proof of stake. Help me see that
so
roadmap.
Sharding and rollups are separate things, right? So rollups are happening right now
on the layer 2.
Arbitrum, yes, you have Arbitrum, you have Optimism, you have different rollups, and sharding is coming later. And each one of these things, rollups is going to increase the throughput for Ethereum by about 100 times. And then sharding is going to increase that by another 100 times, and they compound. So it's 100 times.
100.
Times
100 times the new network speed of 100 times.
So we're going to end up with like 7 to 10,000 increased capacity to transact. So that's a whole lot.
And then there you go, which is why we see the networks producing very different transaction and fee volume. Let's take a look at that. Okay, there it is, the transaction fees. What are we seeing here?
All right, so we talked about the fundamentals for Ethereum versus Bitcoin, and one key metric that is, I'd say, probably the most important key metric for layer 1 networks is the total network revenue from fees that is being created, right? So this is equivalent to cash flow, and it's so important for monetary networks because this is what establishes the capability of the network to have a non-inflationary monetary policy. So it's a big mouthful there too, but what does that mean? Is it the security of the network is financed mainly by two things, and it's financed by the transaction revenue, meaning when users transact and they pay for the transaction fees, that money goes into the security of the network. And if that is not enough, the crypto economics for these networks establishes something else to fill in the gap. So there's a subsidy there because transaction network fees are not enough, and that subsidy exists in the form of issuance. So if you want to get rid of the subsidy that is issuance, then you have to increase network fees. That is in a nutshell. And Ethereum has this other form of, and Bitcoin to a certain degree too has a source of revenue called MEV, which is miner extractable value. And, that we're not going to talk about that. In Bitcoin is negligible, but, mainly, if we just focus on transaction fee revenue and issuance, then you can say, well, this is the security budget for the network, meaning, what is financing the operation for miners, which secures the network? How do you incentivize miners to engage in mining? And, mining is just really processing transactions. While you do that, that whole operation is financed by transaction fees and is subsidized by issuance. So let's look at how Ethereum compares to Bitcoin in terms of how much fees are being generated by the system.
Yeah.
Let's look at how Ethereum is comparing to Bitcoin in terms of these transaction fees that is being generated. So on a 7-day average basis, Ethereum is processing about $27 million worth of transactions. So that's transaction fee revenue for Ethereum. And in the same time period, Bitcoin only generated about $515,000, right, per day. And again, what does that mean? Well, that means that the ability of these networks to sustain a non-inflationary monetary policy is determined by this number. And in case of Bitcoin, it's about, it's been ranging from like 30 to about 80 times more than Bitcoin. And in the case of Bitcoin, if you look at the total revenue for miners, meaning the total security budget, the part that is non-subsidized by issuance, which is the transaction fee revenue, it's just about 1.5% currently today. So today we'll look at we're Bitcoin's processing in a revenue of about $500,000 worth of transaction fees per day. Within a day, it issues 900 Bitcoins because there's 6.25 Bitcoins newly minted every block, and there's a block every 10 minutes. So that's about 900. It is exactly actually 900 Bitcoins per day on average. The block time varies a little bit, but and then you multiply that by the current market value of Bitcoin, and then you come up with the number that the subsidized part of the security budget of this issuance is about 98.5%. And Bitcoiners are saying, well, that's not a big deal. It will eventually fix itself. Eventually fix itself. They don't say how, and they can't really establish like what is the minimum security budget that you think it would be suitable. Well, it's hard to,
it's not 500,000 a day.
Well, so I don't think it's 500. If we were to cut, the security budget to $500,000, it means that now you would have the incentive to miners cut by about 98.5%. That means that the hash power of the network would fall dramatically, maybe not about 98%. You have to take into account the current profitability as well. But, you can't take that off, right? You couldn't take that issuance off. And certainly you have to think about into the future. Okay, what are the incentives for people to transact directly on the Bitcoin network? And what is the capacity of that network to transact as well?
Let me play this back to you because it's so if I'm thinking of Bitcoin, the transaction fees represent the usage. So what you're saying is
it represents Yeah. So let me, sorry to cut you off, but it represents, the value for block space. It represents the usage, but also represents the value of transacting on the network. Because you could have, another
Yes.
network that has, 100 times the throughput capacity. And, if people are not really willing to, if the transit block space capacity for, a different network, like I say EOS, people don't really care for EOS, is a better example. But let's say like NEO,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
NEO is a different, more centralized blockchain network that you can pay for transactions optionally. And if people are not willing to pay, they're going to pay a minimum value. And once you get saturated there and the throughput is
Yeah.
saturated, people are not
Fair.
really going to want to transact because they're not willing to pay for it. So the fact that Bitcoin is already saturated, so it's operating at capacity, then it becomes a question, okay, how much are people willing to pay to transact in the Bitcoin network? So that becomes a factor of, okay, about 6 transactions per second times the amount of money that they're willing to transact in the network. So that's that formula for you. And, you get about, in the Bitcoin network, you get about $515,000 worth of transaction fee revenue a day. Why? Because there's not much you can do with Bitcoin. You can just send
Well, I
Bitcoin
guess,
from one
yeah, I
person
think
to
that's
another.
where I'm going. I'm trying to understand maybe this is another episode, but we'll stick with it for a sec. I'm trying to understand. So if you're saying that 90% of the incentives for miners to
98.5%.
98.5% of the incentives for the miners to secure the network,
Yep.
which is essentially create the blockchain. It is the internet of the Bitcoin network.
Right. Yeah. You lose that, the network
so that's it.
goes
That's it.
bust.
So
Yeah.
you're saying. So I guess what's really concerning there is that the incentives far outweigh the value of that the community is putting on the transactions, and that's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable, in my opinion, because you have to take into account what's happening in the bigger context, right? And what's happening in the bigger context is Bitcoins, the transactions are being externalized, meaning you have things like Ethereum where you have wrapped Bitcoins. So what happens was, a group of people take a number of Bitcoins and they send to a specific address in the Bitcoin network. Yeah. And that address becomes the reserves for something else that is on the Ethereum network. So they take, let's say, you transfer 1,000 Bitcoins to a reserve wallet in the Bitcoin network, and then that same entity on the Ethereum network mints 1,000 wrapped Bitcoins. They're called wrapped Bitcoins. Because why? Because you have a verifiable reserve on the Bitcoin network, and you're issuing this new asset on Ethereum that corresponds on a one-to-one basis to that reserve. And now that reserve stays frozen in the Bitcoin network. People are not going to transact with it, and they're going to use that in the Ethereum network. So you're externalizing the demand for transacting in the network from Bitcoin to Ethereum. And why would you want to do that in Ethereum? Well, because you have, first of all, you have DeFi in Ethereum, which you don't have in Bitcoin. So you have all kinds of financial applications and things you can do with it. But then in the longer term, also, you have this much cheaper system just to transact with, even for simple transactions. And Bitcoiners would push back and say, well, that right now it's cheaper to transact simple transactions in the Bitcoin network, and that to some degree is true if you're using the Lightning Network. But then it comes with the caveats of having to use the Lightning Network, and versus, if you're just using Ethereum network and using the rollups, as we mentioned, which they don't introduce the clunkiness of Lightning payment channels, which is like data availability risk, channel limits, and you have to open a channel, you have to close a channel, none of that. So if you just use the layer 2 for Ethereum, the cost to transact right now is 17 cents if you're using Loopring, which is a ZK rollup option. So, but generally people are transferring out of Bitcoin network, they're wrapping it into Ethereum because of DeFi and the things you can do in the Ethereum economy. and you don't have that in Bitcoin. But no, that's not the only thing. And right now there's over, I'm just gonna say the number on top of my head, but it's like between 1 and 1.5%, I think, of the total supply of Bitcoins are wrapped in Ethereum. So that means that that at least that much of Bitcoins have been frozen in the Bitcoin network, and they're not going to be transacted at all. And it just so happens that it's not just 1.5% of the Bitcoin supply; it's about 1.5% of the total supply, and that and when you look at the type of user that is doing that, those are the active users that would be transacting on the network, right? So they're transferring this to the Ethereum network because they want to transact with it. So when you look at it, the effect that it has on the demand for block space for Bitcoin, it's not really just 1% or 1.5%. It's going to be a lot larger than that, because we're talking about the users that actually transact in the network, and that's just a fraction of the total supply. So that's being transferred to Ethereum. But on the other hand, you have these other things coming along, like Strike. So Strike is a custodial service for Bitcoin that integrates with the Lightning Network, meaning it allows for users to deposit using the Lightning Network, to withdraw the Lightning into the Lightning Network, but the system itself, it's its own private network. So Strike is as a private network that interacts with the Lightning Network. But when you're sending your, if you're a Strike user, you're sending money from yourself to someone else, that's going to be using their private network. If you're doing the custodial wallet. So that means, again, that you're externalizing the transactions, and that is reducing demand for the Bitcoin network.
Right.
You have Strike, and then you have like something like Chivo, right? So El Salvador has recently introduced their Chivo wallet. It's a custodial wallet provided by the government, and everyone that is transacting in it within Chivo to Chivo wallet, they're using just a private network that is externalizing transactions from the Bitcoin network. And so why do you have that happening? Why is that happening?
The friction and the scalability you talked about.
It's because of friction. Exactly. So, and friction exists not just as a form of, okay, well, it costs X to transact, but it's also in the usability, in the user experience, right? So it's the Lightning Network, and then opening a channel, and, making, and then committing, and then doing all the things that you have to do for it, and making sure you're like within the channel limits. That doesn't have a good user experience. And even if they figured some kind of magic to fix that problem, then you have this other problem where, well, if you make a slight mistake, and when you're sending it to an address, and it's like this kind of cryptic mishmash of numbers and letters, if you make a slight mistake there and you send it to the wrong person, it's gone, right? So those are things that need to be addressed. And so the user experience needs to be improved. The transactional cost needs to be improved. And it's extremely difficult to do that directly on the Bitcoin network, because it doesn't have the programmability to solve those problems. And those are things that are being solved in Ethereum. So you have things like the Ethereum namespace, where we have there are solutions for that in the Ethereum network. So it's
I think we might be finding a good spot to close here, because I think what we're seeing is, you've got another tweet that says that I think we'll start with next week, but it's around the challenges that Bitcoin faces on scalability. So you've got this hard money network that is designed for decentralization, store of value, all that good stuff. It's made trade-offs on the experience and scalability to maintain that. Now it's trying to be more for the globe scale, but in order for it creates everything that it doesn't want, because you have to have all these centralized services to enable it, and to be truly operating on the decentralized system that is Bitcoin is impossible for the regular human to do on a day-to-day basis. So
centralized custodial services,
centralized. That's not what we're talking about, and that's like what the Bitcoin maximalists, or even anyone who's about Bitcoin or decentralization, would be. That's not what this is meant to be.
Yeah. And really, I just want to also interject that, because it's not that, these things are happening now, and there's a solution for it. The problem is that they're happening now, and there is no solution for it.
Right.
There's no roadmap to get away from it in the Bitcoin network, and it's not. And they're committed to not creating a solution for this. So it's only going to get worse. So that dynamic.
That's what we need to hear. We need to hear the Bitcoin community responding to that.
Yeah, I know the response. So the response is they'll say, well, the users, it is because I interact with, with them on a lot. So they'll say, well, the users are using that, and that's just kind of a stepping stone, but everyone can withdraw, right? If you're using Chivo or, the El Salvador wallet, or if you're using Strike, you can still withdraw. So this is just like something for people to get acquainted with and withdraw. Well, here's the problem with that. So we already established that it's mathematically impossible for the Lightning Network to work for mass adoption because it's bottlenecked by layer one. It's bottlenecked by 6 transactions about per second. You could say maybe you can batch transactions, you can do other things, but it's not going to get anywhere near the amount of throughput you would need. And the user experience has a limit to it because at the end, you're transacting with the properties of this public-private cryptography system, and you're sending money to a mishmash of numbers and letters, and you're receiving, and you make a mistake, and it's boom, you're done, right?
Yeah.
You lost your money. So those things cannot be addressed directly on a layer that fully preserves the security properties of Bitcoin. And that means that you're going to have to build on top of it. And if you have this, Bitcoin, which is like this amazing foundation on bedrock, like they like to call it, it's built on granite, but then and then you're going to build a level 2 on top of that, right? And you're going to be operating on top of that, and you build that on straws, and you build that on hay, and you build that on something weak. Well, it doesn't matter that the foundation is rock solid because you're not living there, you're living on top of it. So so when you look at the system as a whole, it's not just what the foundation is. If the user is actually living inside of layer 2, then it's the weaker of the two that matters.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental difference for Ethereum, where you could make an argument, and even though I disagree with that you can make an argument that Bitcoin is even more decentralized than Ethereum and more secure. But the problem is, for it to be usable for the regular person, they don't have access to that, at a mass scale. So they're going to have access to something else that is built on top of it. And then it's the weaker of those two things that matter at the end. So
I think that's a good spot for us to close and launch this podcast and see what the community says and how they respond.
All right. Sounds good.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have questions about this episode? We're going to have a space on X time, and we record that as well, and then we have that engagement with the community.
Love it.
Hello? Hey. All right, we're back.
Fuck.
Hey, and then they say Windows is not reliable. Your Mac is crashing out on us, man. What happened there?
That was the work. Let's do the intro.